It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where you just want to sip your coffee, check on your animals, and get on with your day. But when I walked out to feed my livestock, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It's a big, sturdy gate to my barn. The one I built with my own hands to keep my animals safe was completely gone. Not damaged, not leaning. Gone. All that was left behind were tire marks in the dirt and a cracked post dangling like a loose tooth. I couldn't believe it until I saw the HOA's warning notice pinned to the tree by the driveway. They claimed the barn gate violated neighborhood appearance guidelines, that it obstructed community uniformity. Never mind that I live on land zoned for agriculture. Never mind that this is a working barn, not some backyard decoration. And never mind that they didn't even knock or call before tearing it out. Just like that, the HOA decided my farm was an eyesore and they took matters into their own hands at first. I tried to stay calm. I made calls, wrote emails, even went to their office to talk it out. Nothing worked. They brushed me off like I was the problem. That's when something inside me snapped. I looked over at their fancy new community pool, barely used, sparkling clean, and paid for with outrageous HOA fees on. An idea started to form. I didn't want revenge. I wanted to teach them a lesson. A real-life, down-to-earth wake-up call, so I brought the farm to them. What happened next had the whole neighborhood talking, and it made the HOA wish they'd never touched that gate. But I'll let you see that for yourself, because this was just the beginning. Now, before we get into what I did, let me take you back a little. I've lived on this land for over 15 years. It's not some fancy ranch or big operation, just a humble setup where I raise a few goats, some chickens, and keep a couple of cows. The barn was one of the first things I built when I moved in. It wasn't flashy, just strong, practical, and safe for the animals. And until recently, no one had a problem with it. But everything started changing when a new HOA board took over. They were more aggressive, more nitpicky, and seemed determined to modernize the neighborhood Devon if that meant stepping on people like me. They started with letters. Then came the fines. And when I pushed back, they accused me of bringing down property values. That's when I knew it wasn't about community, it was about control. What really set them off, I think, was when I refused to take down the gate. They said it didn't match the neighborhood's look. I said it wasn't in the neighborhood, it was on my farm. That back and forth went on for weeks, until suddenly, without warning, the gate was gone. No notice, no permission, just disappeared. I asked around, and one of my neighbors said he saw a contractor hired by the HOA hauling it away in a flatbed. Apparently, they claimed it was unauthorized construction. Can you believe that? A gate to a working barn being labeled unauthorized. That was the moment I realized they weren't going to stop. They didn't care about my animals, my safety, or even the truth. They wanted me to fall in line or disappear. And that's when I started planning, not to be petty, but to make a point they'd never forget. And let me tell you, the pool was only the start. The more I thought about what they did, the more it sank. And this wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about respect, about boundaries, about people who think rules only apply one way. I had followed every county guideline for agricultural land. I even got permits back when I built the barn. But none of that seemed to matter to the HOA. They saw land, not people, and definitely not animals that needed care and safety. I started getting quiet support from some neighbors, folks who had their own run-ins with the HOA. One family had a treehouse taken down because it was too tall. Another was fined for parking their RV in their own driveway. We weren't the only ones tired of the nonsense. But no one wanted to speak up. The HOA had a reputation for dragging things out in court or burying people in fees until they gave up. Still, the frustration in the community was growing like a slow burn. Meanwhile, I had to deal with real problems. With no gate, my animals were exposed. I had to use old pallets and wire just to keep the goats from wandering off. Every night, I stayed up listening for sounds, worried about coyotes or strays. And every day, I saw that pool sparkling blue, fenced off like some kind of palace just sitting there. No one used it during the week and weekends. Maybe 3 people showed up. It was more of a trophy than a shared space. That's when the idea became real. If they could rip down something useful because it didn't fit their look, maybe it was time they saw what real utility looked like. I started asking questions, learning the HOA's own rules about common space usage. I kept my plans quiet, but I wasn't hiding. Not anymore. They wanted to play hardball, they picked the wrong barn owner. The week after they tore down my barn gate, I barely slept. I was juggling chores, repairs, and watching my animals like a hawk. Every time I looked at that empty space where the gate used to be, it reminded me of how easily the HOA had overstepped. But I wasn't about to let them win. I kept my head down, acted normal, and waited for the right moment. One afternoon, while I was picking up supplies from the feed store, I overheard a local talking about the HOA's monthly pool maintenance HOA. It happened like clockwork every third Thursday, early morning, before sunrise. That gave me just enough of a window. It wasn't about damage or destruction. Don't roll that way. It was about making a point. A peaceful but unforgettable one. I spent the next few days preparing. I built temporary fencing and rounded up help from 2 close friends who'd been on the receiving end of the HOA's nonsense too. We didn't tell anyone what was happening, just asked for a couple hours of time and a favor or two. The day before the pool plan, I walked past the HOA office and nodded at their security cameras, knowing full well they'd be looking at me soon enough. That night, just before dawn, we moved carefully. Quiet, respectful, but with purpose. I loaded the livestock goats, a few ducks, and 1 very calm cane to the trailer. Everything was legal, nothing harmful, just country life making. A short visit to the most underused amenity in the neighborhood. As the sun began to rise, the animals stepped out into the community pool area. The looks on the early walkers' faces were priceless. Phones came out, someone screamed, and that's when the HOA president showed up, half-dressed, jaw on the floor. The moment was electric and it was far from over. The HOA president stood frozen, sandals half on, staring at the scene like he couldn't believe it was real. My livestock were calmly making themselves at home, ducks paddling in the shallow end, goats curiously sniffing the lifeguard chair, and my cow standing in the corner like she owned the place. People gathered fast. Some laughed, some filmed, and a few even clapped. It was chaotic, sure, but not out of control. The animals were gentle. Nothing was damaged. But the message was loud and clear. The president stormed over, red-faced, pointing, and sputtering about violations, bylaws, and legal action. I calmly reminded him the pool was labeled as a shared amenity space for all residents, with no specific rules about species. He didn't like that. Not one bit. He called for immediate removal, but I stood my ground and said I'd be happy to comply once they addressed the destruction of my barn gate and replaced what they tore down without notice. But then, just as tensions were boiling, a second twist hit us from an angle no one saw coming. A local news crew had shown up. Apparently, someone had tipped them off about farm animals occupying a suburban HOA pool. And they rolled in with cameras rolling and microphones ready. Suddenly, it wasn't just a neighborhood spat, it was public. The reporter asked me why I did it, and I told her straight. The HOA tore down my barn gate without warning. I figured if they don't want my farm fenced in, maybe it's time the community got a closer look at what they're messing with. As the camera turned to the HOA president, he went pale. His voice cracked as he tried to explain their side. But the crowd wasn't buying it. And just like that, the balance shifted. I could feel the pressure building, not just for me, but for the whole community. What started as a personal fight was turning into something much bigger. By the time the news segment aired that evening, the story had already taken off online. Clips of goats lounging by the pool and ducks splashing around were going viral under hashtags like hashtag HOAV's farmer and hashtag poolside livestock. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly at my fence offering support, some even sharing their own HOA horror stories. What began as a personal stand had turned into a neighborhood movement. People were tired of being pushed around. The board had no idea what they'd stirred up. Under pressure from the media and growing public support, the HOA called for an emergency meeting that weekend. It was supposed to be private, but word got out. More than half the neighborhood showed up, and for the first time, people weren't afraid to speak. One after another, folks stood up and shared how they'd been fined, ignored, or intimidated by the board. It was a flood of frustration that had been building for years, and now it was pouring out. I stayed quiet at first, just listening. But when they asked me to speak, I laid it all out: how they tore down my gate without notice, how they ignored my calls, and how their rules seemed to only apply when it suited them. The room went quiet. The president tried to respond, but no one was listening anymore. A motion was made: new elections for the board. Unanimous, just like that. Change had begun. But here's the twist I never saw coming. A week later, I got a knock on my door. It was the former HOA president holding a check. He looked tired, humbled. "For your gate," he said. And ... maybe we've got a little carried away. I took the check, nodded, but didn't say much. He turned to leave, then paused. "Funny thing," he said. "The pool's actually gotten more use this week than it ever has." I couldn't help but smile. Turns out, sometimes the best way to stand up for yourself, is to bring your cows to the pool after that unexpected visit from the former HOA president. Things started to settle down, but not quite like before. The new board, elected by the community, brought a fresh perspective. They reached out to me and a few other neighbors to discuss how to balance the neighborhood's rules with respect for people's homes and land. It felt like a real conversation, not just a list of demands. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted from tension to cooperation. I got my gate back, rebuilt stronger than ever, but with a compromise that respected the neighborhood's look without sacrificing the safety of my animals. The HOA even agreed to add some basic guidelines that made sense for everyone, not just the loudest voices on the board. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. More importantly, it was proof that standing up calmly and firmly can make a difference. The pool, surprisingly, became a new gathering spot. People who never used it before started bringing their families, pets, and yes, even a few curious goats from time to time. It turned from a symbol of exclusion into something that brought the community together. Sometimes it took a little disruption to open eyes and hearts. Looking back, I never expected that a torn-down barn gate and a livestock bath in a pool would spark such change. But it reminded me maybe all of us that respect and communication matter more than rules written on paper. If you feel like you're being pushed around, sometimes the best way forward is to stand your ground with a little creativity and a lot of patience. So if you ever find yourself fighting an unfair system, remember, it's not about winning against others, it's about making space for everyone to live and thrive. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it inspires you to speak up for what matters, no matter how big or small the fight. **